Welcome to the world's countries, and to a slightly different episode in our long journey through every nation on Earth. Normally, we choose one country at a time, and we explore its geography, its history, its people, and its place in the wider world. But today, we are not focusing on a single land with its own borders and flag. Instead, we are going to talk about something that connects almost all of them, something that is not a country at all, but a meeting place. A forum, a stage upon which the nations of the world attempt, sometimes with great success and sometimes with deep frustration, to work together. That forum is, of course, the United Nations. The United Nations is not like any other institution in the world. It is at once familiar and yet difficult to fully understand. You have almost certainly heard of it. The name alone suggests something vast and important, but if someone asked you to explain exactly what the UN does, you might hesitate. The truth is that the UN does many different things, some of them very visible, like peacekeeping missions with soldiers wearing distinctive blue helmets, or international meetings about climate change. Other things the UN does are more hidden, like coordinating humanitarian aid, setting global standards in aviation or shipping, or quietly helping countries share knowledge on health, education, or technology. What makes the UN unique is that it brings almost all of the world's countries together under one roof. Out of the 195 countries we usually count, 193 are members of the United Nations. Only 2 states with wide recognition remain outside. The Holy See, representing the Vatican, which has chosen not to be a member but holds observer status, and Palestine, which is also an observer. This means that nearly every flag, nearly every anthem, and nearly every voice we have already discussed in this podcast has a place inside the United Nations. The story of the UN begins with war. In the first half of the 20th century, the world experienced not one but 2 global conflicts of devastating scale. The First World War, fought from 1914 to 1918, was supposed to be the war to end all wars. Instead, it was followed just 2 decades later by the even more destructive Second World War, from 1939 to 1945. That war left tens of millions dead, entire cities destroyed, and entire populations displaced. When it ended, the leaders of the victorious Allied powers were determined to create a new international system that might prevent such a catastrophe from happening again. The United Nations was officially founded in 1945, in the aftermath of that war, when representatives from 50 countries met in San Francisco to sign the UN Charter. The Charter was not simply a treaty. It was a statement of hope. It declared that the peoples of the world were determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, to promote social progress, and to practice tolerance and live together in peace. It was an ambitious vision, perhaps even an impossible one. And yet, nearly 80 years later, the United Nations still exists. It still gathers the world's countries in New York City and in Geneva, in Vienna and in Nairobi, and in countless meetings and missions around the globe. It is imperfect, often slow, sometimes paralyzed by disagreements between powerful nations. But it remains the only arena where almost all of humanity can, at least in theory, sit down together. What is the UN? So, what exactly is the United Nations? It sounds simple enough, a union of nations, but the truth is more complicated and perhaps more interesting once we slow down and look at it closely. At its core, the United Nations is an international organization. That phrase, international organization, is one we sometimes take for granted. It means an institution that does not belong to one single country, but to all countries that join it. Unlike a government, which rules a specific territory and a specific population, the United Nations does not control land. It does not have citizens. It does not have an army of its own, even if it sometimes sends peacekeepers into conflicts. What it has instead is a charter, a written agreement, and the trust of its member states, who use the UN as a common space to talk, to argue, to negotiate, and when possible, to agree. The United Nations was officially established on October 24, 1945, a date now marked each year as United Nations Day. That day, the UN Charter came into force after being ratified by the 5 great powers of the time: the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, China, and France, together with a majority of other signatories. From the very beginning, the structure of the UN reflected both idealism and realism. The idealism was in its promise: never again would the world allow such catastrophic war. The realism was in the special role given to the most powerful states, especially in the Security Council, where 5 permanent members were granted veto power. Membership grew rapidly. The original 50 states have become 193. Nearly every recognized country in the world today has chosen to join. Even very small states, with populations of just a few tens of thousands, have equal seats in the General Assembly, alongside giants like India and the United States. That in itself is a remarkable achievement. A room where the voice of Tuvalu can, at least formally, be heard on the same terms as the voice of China. But to understand the UN, we must look not only at its membership, but also at its goals. The Charter sets out 4 main purposes: to maintain international peace and security, to develop friendly relations among nations, to achieve international cooperation in solving global problems, and to be a center for harmonizing the actions of nations. These goals are broad, almost poetic. They are not about small details. They are about big, universal ideas: peace, friendship, cooperation, harmony, words that seem simple but prove difficult to realize in practice. The UN is structured around 6 main organs, each with a distinct role. The first, and perhaps the most visible, is the General Assembly. This is the great meeting hall where all 193 member states sit together. Each has one vote, whether it is a vast federation or a tiny island. The General Assembly is not a parliament in the usual sense. Its resolutions are not binding law. They are recommendations, statements of the will of the international community. Still, they matter. They set norms. They give legitimacy. They show what the world, or at least most of it, believes to be right. When the General Assembly voted to adopt the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, it did not create a binding treaty, but it gave the world a moral compass that has guided discussions on rights and freedoms ever since. The second organ is the Security Council, the most powerful body within the UN system. Here, 15 countries sit at a time. 5 permanent members: the United States, Russia, China, France, and the United Kingdom, and 10 elected members who serve for 2 years. The Council can authorize sanctions, peacekeeping missions, and even the use of force. Its decisions are binding on all members. But the Council also contains the greatest contradiction of the UN: the veto. Any one of the 5 permanent members can block a decision, even if every other country in the world supports it. This reflects the power realities of 1945, when the Allies of World War II designed a system that they themselves would accept. It has kept the great powers inside the UN, but it has also meant deadlock in many crises, from Syria to Ukraine. The third organ is the International Court of Justice, seated in The Hague in the Netherlands. This is the judicial branch of the UN, where disputes between states can be brought and judged. Its rulings, like its location, remind us that international law is both fragile and significant. States must consent to the court's authority, but when they do, its decisions carry great weight. It has ruled on borders, on the use of force, on issues of sovereignty. It is not the only international court in the world, but it is the principal one under the UN umbrella. The fourth is the Secretariat, the administrative arm of the United Nations. It is headed by the Secretary General, who is both a bureaucrat and at times a moral voice. The Secretary General is appointed by the General Assembly upon recommendation of the Security Council and serves a 5-year renewable term. The current Secretary General is António Guterres of Portugal, in office since 2017. His role is often described as the world's top diplomat, though in reality he has limited formal power. What he has instead is the ability to bring attention to issues, to mediate quietly, and to represent the conscience of the international community. The fifth organ is the Economic and Social Council, or ECOSOC. Its name may sound dry, but its scope is enormous. Through it, the UN coordinates economic and social work, including health, culture, education, and development. ECOSOC oversees a network of specialized agencies. Institutions like the World Health Organization, UNESCO, the International Labor Organization, and many others, which are legally independent but connected through agreements with the UN. In this way, the United Nations touches everyday life in ways most people do not even notice. Standards for air travel, for shipping, for telecommunications, for disease control, all are shaped by this global network. The sixth and final principal organ is the Trusteeship Council, which was created to oversee territories that were not yet self-governing after World War II. Its purpose was to ensure that colonies were administered in the best interests of their inhabitants and guided toward independence. With the completion of decolonization, the Trusteeship Council suspended its operations in 1994. It still formally exists, but it no longer meets. Its story is a reminder of how much the UN has been linked to the transformations of the 20th century. Beyond these 6 organs, the United Nations is a sprawling system, often called the UN family. It includes funds, programs, and specialized agencies that address hunger, refugees, children, health, labor, culture, and countless other issues. Together they form a web of international cooperation that may appear chaotic, but which reflects the wide ambitions of the organization. What is the UN, then? It is not a world government. It is not a parliament. It is not a court that can force obedience in every case. It is rather a stage. It is the place where countries meet. Sometimes they fight with words. Sometimes they negotiate treaties. Sometimes they fail to act. And sometimes they succeed in ways that shape lives around the globe. The eradication of smallpox, the coordination of humanitarian relief after disasters, the spread of international human rights standards, all of these are part of the UN story. It is easy to criticize the United Nations for what it cannot do. It cannot prevent every war. It cannot force the most powerful states to obey. It cannot make peace where none of the parties are willing. But it is also worth pausing to consider what the world might look like without it. Imagine nearly 200 nations, each acting entirely on its own, without a forum to speak, to accuse, to defend, to plead, or to compromise. The United Nations, for all its flaws, remains that forum. In the end, the United Nations is both a dream and a mechanism. The dream is simple, a world of peace, rights, and cooperation. The mechanism is complex, committees, councils, charters, reports. Together they make up an organization that is not always efficient, but that is always there, always ready to gather the nations once more. And that, in a slow and perhaps roundabout way, is what the UN is, a shared table in a divided world, a place where nearly all the countries we have visited in this podcast sit side by side. How the UN works. Now that we have an idea of what the United Nations is, we can take a slow walk through how it actually works. For an organization that includes almost every country on Earth, the inner workings can appear confusing, even mysterious. The UN is not one single building, not one single meeting, not one single voice. It is many different layers, some loud and visible, others quiet and technical. To understand how it functions, we need to think of it less as a government and more as a stage with several rooms, each serving a different purpose. At the heart of the United Nations, we find the General Assembly. This is perhaps the most democratic part of the system, at least in form. All 193 member states sit here, in the Great Hall in New York City, beneath the green marble podium and the golden backdrop that has become familiar in photographs and news broadcasts. Every country has one vote, whether it has 1 billion people or 100,000. The General Assembly meets once a year in a grand session, where leaders from around the world deliver speeches. These speeches are often long, sometimes passionate, sometimes dull. They rarely decide anything directly, but they set the tone. They allow countries to be heard, to explain their positions, and to appeal to the rest of the world. Resolutions passed by the General Assembly are not binding. They are recommendations, reflections of the mood of the international community. Still, they carry weight. They tell us what most countries think about a conflict, a treaty, or a principle. When the Assembly votes overwhelmingly to condemn apartheid or to recognize the right to self-determination, it does not end the problem at once, but it builds pressure. It creates moral authority. For smaller nations, the General Assembly is the one arena where they can stand as equals among the powerful. Yet, when it comes to real power, the Security Council is where the most decisive actions happen. The Council has 15 seats, 10 of which rotate every 2 years among different countries, while 5 are permanent. These 5, the United States, Russia, China, France, and the United Kingdom, hold veto power. This means that if any one of them votes against a resolution, it cannot pass, no matter how much support it has from the rest of the Council, or even from the entire General Assembly. This veto is both the great strength and the great weakness of the UN. It ensures that the most powerful states remain inside the system, not outside of it, but it also means that in many of the world's most dangerous conflicts, the Council becomes paralyzed. When the Security Council does act, however, its decisions are binding on all members. It can impose sanctions, authorize military interventions, or establish peacekeeping missions. It has, at various times, helped end wars, supervise ceasefires, and provide legal backing for international coalitions. The Council is the closest thing the UN has to an executive authority, though one always limited by the politics of its most powerful members. Beside the General Assembly and the Security Council, there is the Economic and Social Council, usually shortened to ECOSOC. This organ may not make headlines, but it is the bridge that links the United Nations to the daily lives of people everywhere. Through ECOSOC, the UN coordinates its specialized agencies. The World Health Organization, which sets global health standards and leads in times of epidemic. UNESCO, which protects cultural heritage and promotes education. The International Labor Organization, which sets international labor standards, and many others. In a sense, ECOSOC is like a vast network of committees, each focused on a particular field: health, education, labor, environment, where experts and officials gather to share knowledge and create common guidelines. Supporting all of this is the Secretariat, the administrative backbone of the United Nations. Thousands of staff work in offices in New York, Geneva, Vienna, Nairobi, and in many field missions around the world. Their work is not glamorous. It is paperwork, reports, planning, translation, coordination. But without them, the UN would grind to a halt. At the top of the Secretariat is the Secretary General. He, or someday perhaps she, is both manager and diplomat. The Secretary General is not a president of the world, though the title sometimes makes it sound that way. Instead, he is often called a secular pope, a figure who speaks on behalf of humanity, appealing to conscience more than commanding by law. The International Court of Justice, in The Hague, adds another dimension. This is the judicial organ of the UN. Here, disputes between states can be heard and judged. For example, when two countries disagree over a border or accuse one another of using force unlawfully, they can bring the case to the court. The judges, elected by both the General Assembly and the Security Council, rule according to international law. Their decisions are binding, though enforcement depends on the willingness of states to comply. In practice, many do, because the court represents legitimacy. It is not perfect, but it is a symbol that law, not only power, matters in international relations. We should also mention the Trusteeship Council, though it no longer meets. In the years after World War II, it oversaw trust territories, regions that had not yet achieved self-government, and helped guide them toward independence. With the end of decolonization, its work was complete. Today, it is dormant, but its legacy is visible in the many countries that gained independence under its watch. So, this is how the United Nations is structured at the top. But the UN is not only meetings in New York or courts in The Hague. It is also the work carried out by its agencies and programs in the field. When a natural disaster strikes, the UN's World Food Program often delivers emergency supplies. When refugees flee war, the UN Refugee Agency sets up camps, provides shelter, and negotiates with host governments. When a pandemic breaks out, the World Health Organization coordinates international response, gathers data, and provides guidance. These activities are the most practical face of the UN, where decisions made in committees become action on the ground. Of course, the UN does not work alone. It depends on its members. Peacekeepers, for instance, are not soldiers of a UN army, because there is no UN army. They are soldiers sent by member states, wearing their national uniforms, but with the addition of the UN's blue helmet or beret. Funding also comes from the contributions of member states, calculated according to their capacity to pay. This means that some countries, like the United States, contribute very large amounts, while others contribute modestly. The budget is always a subject of debate and sometimes of tension, as countries argue over who pays and how much. Behind the visible work, the UN is also a place of constant negotiation. In conference rooms, diplomats draft resolutions, line by line, word by word. Each phrase may be debated for hours. Words like condemn, deplore, or express concern carry different levels of meaning, and countries care deeply about how they are described. It is slow work, sometimes frustrating, but it is the process by which 193 different voices try to find common ground. In many ways, the UN works not by imposing decisions, but by creating habits of dialogue. It gives states a place to meet, to listen, to compromise. Even when the outcome is modest, the act of talking can lower tensions. Without such a forum, disagreements might escalate more quickly into conflict. The UN is not a world government, but it is a world meeting hall, and the very act of meeting, again and again, year after year, is itself an achievement. To say that the United Nations works smoothly would be untrue. It is often slow, often divided, often criticized for bureaucracy and inefficiency. And yet it continues. It works enough to matter. It works enough to provide hope, however fragile, that the nations of the world can, at least sometimes, act together. That, in the end, is how the United Nations works. Not as a machine of command, but as a web of conversations, agreements, and shared efforts. It is a stage upon which the drama of world politics is played out, sometimes tragic, sometimes hopeful, always ongoing. UN in everyday life. When we hear the words United Nations, we might imagine the Grand Hall of the General Assembly in New York, filled with rows of desks, flags, and microphones. Or we might picture diplomats in suits, delivering long speeches that most people will never listen to. But the reality of the United Nations is not only in those rooms. The work of the UN also unfolds in quiet and practical ways in hospitals, in refugee camps, in schools, in villages struck by disaster, and even in the daily routines of ordinary people who may never think about the organization at all. To understand the United Nations in everyday life, it helps to think of it less as one single body and more as a family of institutions. The UN is like a large tree with many branches. Some of those branches are strong and visible, such as peacekeeping operations or major conferences on climate change. Others are more hidden, like standard-setting agencies or programs that supply technical advice. But they all belong to the same tree, and they all affect how people live. One of the most visible branches is UN peacekeeping. The image of a soldier wearing a blue helmet or a blue beret has become a symbol of the organization itself. These soldiers do not belong to a standing UN army, because no such army exists. Instead, they are provided by member states, trained by their national forces, but placed under UN command for specific missions. Peacekeepers have served in dozens of conflicts since the first mission in 1948. Their role is not usually to fight, but to monitor ceasefires, protect civilians, and create conditions for political solutions. They build confidence where trust has been broken. Their presence does not always guarantee peace, but it often prevents violence from escalating further. Beyond soldiers, the UN works in many humanitarian ways. The World Food Programme, for instance, delivers food assistance to people in emergencies and supports nutrition in poorer countries. When drought strikes, when floods destroy crops, when war forces families to flee, the WFP sets up distribution systems for grains, oils, or fortified foods. This is not glamorous work. It is logistics, ships, trucks, warehouses, supply lines. But without it, millions of people would starve. In fact, in 2020, the World Food Programme received the Nobel Peace Prize for its efforts to combat hunger. Another crucial part of everyday UN work is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, often called UNHCR. Around the world, more than 100 million people are displaced from their homes by war, persecution, or disaster. The UNHCR provides tents, blankets, legal assistance, and above all, a kind of structure in moments of chaos. Refugee camps managed by the UN are not perfect places. They are crowded, temporary, sometimes unsafe. But they are often the difference between survival and despair. For children, perhaps the most familiar UN agency is UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund. Originally created after World War II to provide emergency aid to children in war-torn Europe, UNICEF has become the leading global organization for child welfare. It promotes vaccination programs, supports schools, provides clean water, and campaigns against child labor. If you have ever seen a small cardboard box used for trick-or-treat donations or heard of campaigns for Children First, chances are you have encountered UNICEF. Health is another area where the UN touches daily life, often without us realizing it. The World Health Organization, or WHO, coordinates global efforts on diseases and health standards. When a new virus emerges, as it did with COVID-19, the WHO becomes the hub for data, recommendations, and cooperation. But even in quieter times, WHO sets guidelines for vaccines, for maternal care, for nutrition, and for safety in medical practices. The eradication of smallpox, one of humanity's greatest victories, was achieved through coordinated campaigns led by the WHO. Education and culture also fall within the UN's everyday reach. Through UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. UNESCO is famous for designating World Heritage Sites, landmarks of cultural or natural value that the world agrees to protect. The pyramids of Egypt, the Great Wall of China, the fjords of Norway, the Serengeti in Tanzania, all carry that recognition. But UNESCO also works on more subtle tasks, promoting literacy, supporting press freedom, preserving endangered languages. In doing so, it shapes how knowledge and culture are shared across borders. Other agencies are even more hidden, but just as essential. The International Civil Aviation Organization sets rules for international air travel. The International Maritime Organization does the same for shipping. The Universal Postal Union, one of the oldest agencies, coordinates how letters and packages can move between countries. Without it, sending a postcard from one continent to another would be far more complicated. These organizations rarely appear in the news, but they are the invisible threads that keep a globalized world functioning. The UN is also central to efforts on sustainable development. In 2015, all member states agreed on the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 broad targets ranging from ending poverty to ensuring clean energy, gender equality, and climate action. These goals are not binding law, but they serve as a shared roadmap. They influence government policies, aid programs, and even business strategies. If you hear about efforts to reduce inequality, to provide universal education, or to protect oceans, you are hearing echoes of the UN's agenda. When disasters strike, the UN often acts as the coordinator of international aid. After an earthquake, a tsunami, or a hurricane, it is usually the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs that steps in to manage relief efforts, making sure that different countries and organizations do not duplicate their work, and that resources go where they are most needed. The UN does not always deliver the aid itself, but it provides the structure that allows hundreds of actors to work together. Even in areas we rarely think about, the UN is present. The International Atomic Energy Agency, though technically separate but linked to the UN system, monitors nuclear material to ensure it is not used for weapons. The International Telecommunication Union coordinates radio frequencies and satellites, making sure that the invisible signals in the air do not overlap in chaos. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, though older institutions with complex roles, often cooperate closely with UN programs and development projects. So when we ask, how does the UN show up in everyday life? The answer is almost everywhere. It is in the vaccines children receive. It is in the emergency rations delivered to families in crisis. It is in the passports that are recognized across borders. It is in the cultural treasures preserved for future generations. It is in the very idea that there can be global goals, shared by rich and poor countries alike. Of course, not all of this work is perfect. Peacekeeping missions sometimes fail. Refugee camps sometimes lack safety or resources. Agencies are sometimes slow, burdened by bureaucracy. The UN is criticized for inefficiency, for being too political, or for being too timid. These criticisms are often valid. And yet, without the UN, many of the mechanisms we take for granted would vanish, leaving gaps that no single country could fill alone. Perhaps the most striking feature of the UN's everyday work is that much of it is invisible. Unlike the speeches in New York, it does not seek headlines. It simply happens. Planes take off and land because standards are harmonized. Ships travel across oceans because maritime rules are agreed upon. Aid workers arrive with food, blankets, and medicine because coordination has taken place in the background. The quiet persistence of these tasks, repeated year after year, forms the true backbone of the organization. In this way, the United Nations is not only about lofty ideals. It is also about the mundane, the technical, the administrative. It is about the details that make international life possible. It is a reminder that global cooperation is not only about ending wars, but also about making sure mail is delivered, diseases are tracked, and refugees are sheltered. These are not glamorous things. They are ordinary things. But they are essential things. And so, when we think of the United Nations, we should remember that it is not only a hall of speeches. It is also the hand that vaccinates a child, the truck that brings food to a village, the treaty that keeps air travel safe, and the banner that marks a site as a heritage of all humanity. In this quiet, everyday work, the UN touches lives in ways most people never notice, but which together shape the fabric of our shared world. The UN today, achievements and criticism. The United Nations is nearly 80 years old now, and like a person of that age, it carries both the dignity of experience and the weight of its limitations. It is no longer a young institution filled only with the optimism of 1945, when its charter was first signed. It has lived through decades of Cold War tension, through decolonization, through civil wars and peace processes, through the rise of globalization, and now through the challenges of climate change and pandemics. To understand the UN today, we must look both at what it has achieved and at what it has failed to do, because both are part of its reality. Let us begin with the achievements. Perhaps the most important success of the United Nations is that it has survived. That may sound like faint praise, but it is not. In a world often divided by ideology, religion, wealth, and power, the simple fact that 193 states still meet together in one organization is remarkable. There were moments during the Cold War when East and West barely spoke to one another, when nuclear war seemed possible, and yet the UN continued to provide a space, however fragile, for dialogue. Even today, when relations between major powers are tense, the UN remains the one place where their representatives must sit in the same room. The UN has also made lasting contributions to peace. It has organized and supervised dozens of peacekeeping missions, some of which have played crucial roles in stabilizing conflicts. Missions in Namibia, in Cambodia, in Mozambique, and in the Balkans help countries move from war to peace. Ceasefires have been monitored, elections overseen, and demobilization processes supported by the presence of blue-helmeted peacekeepers. While peacekeeping has not ended all wars, it has prevented many from reigniting, and it has provided breathing space for fragile agreements to hold. Another major achievement is in the field of human rights. In 1948, the General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a document that has become a cornerstone of international law and morality. Though not legally binding, it has inspired constitutions, treaties, and movements around the world. The UN has since created more binding conventions, such as those against torture, against racial discrimination, and for the rights of children. Human rights councils and rapporteurs monitor abuses and shine a light on violations. While abuses still occur, the language of rights has become global, in part because of the UN. Development is another area of real progress. The UN has supported campaigns to eradicate diseases, expand education, and reduce poverty. The Millennium Development Goals, launched in 2000, and the Sustainable Development Goals, agreed upon in 2015, have provided global frameworks that guide national policies and international aid. Many of these goals are ambitious and not fully realized, but they have created momentum. Child mortality has declined, extreme poverty has been reduced, and access to basic education has improved across many regions, all in line with UN-led initiatives. Then there is the humanitarian work. In times of crisis, the UN and its agencies are often among the first to respond. The World Food Programme delivers aid to millions each year. UNHCR provides shelter to refugees. UNICEF supports children in war zones. The UN coordinates relief efforts after earthquakes, tsunamis, and floods, making sure that the help of many different countries is not wasted in duplication or confusion. For countless individuals caught in disaster, the UN is not an abstract idea but the tent, the vaccine, or the bag of rice that keeps them alive. Yet alongside these achievements stand the criticisms, and they are many. The most frequent complaint is that the UN is slow, bureaucratic, and sometimes paralyzed. Its decision-making processes involve long negotiations, with every word of every resolution debated and revised. This caution can mean that urgent crises receive delayed responses. In the Security Council, the veto power of the 5 permanent members often leads to deadlock. On issues such as the conflict in Syria or the invasion of Ukraine or crises in places like Myanmar, the Council has been unable to act decisively because one or more great powers blocked agreement. For people on the ground, suffering violence or displacement, such paralysis makes the UN seem powerless. Another criticism is that the UN reflects the power structure of 1945, not of today. The Security Council's permanent members are the victors of World War II. But the world has changed dramatically since then. Countries like India, Brazil, Nigeria, and South Africa argue that they deserve permanent seats to reflect contemporary realities. The lack of reform fuels frustration, as billions of people are represented in global politics without equal voice at the top table. The UN is also accused of being too political in some areas and too weak in others. Its human rights mechanisms, for example, are valuable but often criticized for inconsistency. Some governments accuse the UN of focusing more on certain regions than others, depending on the influence of powerful states. Others accuse it of issuing reports and statements without the ability to enforce them. The very universality of the UN means it must work with governments of all kinds, including authoritarian ones, and this creates tension between principles and pragmatism. There have been scandals as well. Some peacekeeping missions have faced allegations of abuse by the very soldiers meant to protect civilians. These cases damage trust and highlight the challenge of oversight when personnel are provided by national armies but operate under the UN flag. Financial inefficiency is another recurring issue. The UN's vast system of agencies and programs requires coordination and funding, and critics say resources are wasted in overlapping mandates and excessive bureaucracy. Despite these weaknesses, it is important to note that the UN's failures often reflect the disagreements of its members, rather than flaws in the institution itself. The UN is not an independent actor that can impose peace. It is only as strong as its members allow it to be. When great powers disagree, the UN cannot force them to cooperate. When countries fail to pay their dues, the UN cannot conjure resources out of thin air. To expect the UN to do what its members refuse to do is to misunderstand its nature. Still, the criticisms point to real challenges. Reform of the Security Council has been discussed for decades, with little progress. Efforts to streamline the bureaucracy face resistance from those who benefit from the status quo. Balancing universality with effectiveness remains a constant struggle. And yet, for all its flaws, the UN continues to matter because there is no alternative. Imagine a world without the United Nations. No General Assembly to voice collective opinion. No Security Council to authorize peacekeeping. No WHO to coordinate pandemic response. No WFP to deliver food in emergencies. No forum where almost every country, large or small, can speak to all the others at once. The absence of the UN would not mean fewer problems, but fewer tools to manage them. The UN today is, in many ways, a mirror of the world itself. It shows us our capacity for cooperation and our tendency toward division. It contains both lofty ideals and frustrating compromises. It is praised as indispensable and condemned as ineffective, often in the same breath. Perhaps that is the price of being the world's meeting place. It reflects the world as it is, not as we might wish it to be. In the end, the United Nations is both a success and a disappointment, a symbol of hope and a reminder of limits. It is a stage on which humanity plays out its disagreements, but also its dreams. It has achieved more than many expected, and less than many hoped. Yet it remains, And as long as it remains, it offers at least the possibility of dialogue, cooperation, and shared action. That perhaps is the greatest achievement of all. Not perfection, not the end of conflict, but the persistence of a place where the nations of the world can still come together. As we come to the end of this special episode of the world's countries, we return to the thought we began with. Normally, we speak of nations one by one, their borders, their histories, their people, and their place in the wider world. But today, we have spoken about something that is not a country at all, and yet is made entirely of countries. The United Nations is, in a sense, the world's common meeting place, a table where almost every chair is filled, where almost every flag is represented, and where almost every government has a voice. The UN was born out of a particular moment in history, the devastation of the Second World War. Its founders wanted to ensure that such destruction would never again engulf the world. They dreamed of an institution that could protect peace, defend human rights, and encourage cooperation. The words of the Charter are still printed in black and white. To save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. These are ambitious words, lofty words, perhaps even utopian. And yet, they continue to guide the work of the UN today. We have seen how the organization is structured, with its Great Hall in New York where all nations speak, its Security Council where decisions are made and blocked, its court in The Hague, its administrative secretariat, and its many agencies that carry out specialized work. We have looked at how the UN appears not only in speeches and treaties, but also in everyday life, in the form of food for the hungry, vaccines for children, tents for refugees, cultural sites preserved for humanity, and technical standards that keep our interconnected world functioning. We have also seen both sides of its record, the achievements and the criticisms. The UN has helped decolonization, supported peace, advanced human rights, and coordinated global development. It has been a force for stability in a chaotic world. And yet, it has also been slow, sometimes powerless, sometimes paralyzed by the very states that created it. It reflects the structure of 1945 more than the realities of today, and reform has proven elusive. The criticisms are real, but they do not erase the achievements. So what is the UN, finally? It is not a perfect machine. It is not a world government. It is not a solution to every problem. What it is a framework, a habit, a process. It is the ongoing act of bringing nations together, again and again, year after year, to speak, to listen, to argue, and sometimes to agree. Even when the outcomes are modest, the act of gathering is itself an achievement. Perhaps the best way to think of the UN is not as a building or as a bureaucracy, but as a mirror. It reflects the world as it is, divided, unequal, imperfect. But it also reflects what the world might be, more cooperative, more peaceful, more humane. It is both a reminder of our limits and an expression of our hopes. For the purposes of this podcast, the United Nations is also a useful reminder. When we talk about each country one by one, it can sometimes feel like they exist in isolation, with their own unique stories. But the truth is that they are connected through trade, through culture, through conflict, and through cooperation. And nowhere is that connection more visible than in the United Nations, where almost all of them sit side by side. And so, as we conclude this episode, we invite you to reflect on the paradox of the UN. It is at once a symbol of global unity and a symbol of global division. It is frustrating and yet indispensable. It is criticized for its failures and yet impossible to imagine doing without. It is both flawed and necessary. Thank you for joining us on this slower, wider journey into the story of the United Nations. In our next episode, we will return to a single country once more. But for now, let us pause here at this table of nations and appreciate what it represents. The idea that in a world of nearly 200 independent states, there can still be a place, however imperfect, where they come together.